Gynt here, and welcome to At Home with Music. This is part 2 of the top 10 composers. And I should preface this by saying that these are my top 10 composers as of this moment. It's a beautiful fall day here in Asheville, North Carolina. I was going to take this outside, but it's too windy, and so there would have been a lot of background noise. So I'm back here in my video recording room, and I'd like to share with you now my top 5 composers. You'll probably recognize these guys, and I'm going to start with Edvard Grieg. And you're hearing in the background his Hall of the Mountain King, which is one of his most famous pieces. Now, Grieg, he was a Norwegian composer. He was also a pianist, and he's considered one of the main romantic composers. I gotta be able to say romantic. His music is part of the standard classical repertoire. Everybody knows his piano concerto, and of course everybody knows the Hall of the Mountain King, very famous. And he used a lot of Norwegian folk music in his compositions, and he brought the music of Norway to fame, and he helped develop a national identity of the music of Norway, just like Jean Sibelius did in Finland and Bedřich Smetana in Bohemia. And so that's Grieg. And what attracts me to the music of Edvard Grieg, of course, is its Norwegian component. And that kind of plays into my own background. My father is Mexican. That's how I ended up with a Spanish name. But my mom was half Swedish and half Norwegian. So my paternal grandfather was Swedish, and not paternal, but maternal. My mother's father was Swedish, and he was a Swedish immigrant. My grandma, on my mother's side, was Norwegian. She was a Norwegian immigrant. So there is that side of my upbringing, and the music of Grieg, of course, is very melodic, very beautiful, and I would encourage you to pursue it further. Number 4 on my list, I should have mentioned that Grieg is number 5, is Felix Mendelssohn. And he is a German composer, a pianist, an organist, and a conductor, and he is part of the early Romantic period. In fact, he's been referred to as the classical romantic. And he wrote symphonies and concertos and piano music, organ music, chamber music. And what draws me to Mendelssohn is his best known work, which includes the Songs Without Words. That's one of his best known works, I should say. He also wrote A Midsummer's Night's Dream, the Italian Symphony, the Scottish Symphony, the Oratorio of St. Paul, and the Oratorio Elijah. He also was instrumental in reintroducing the public to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. We'll get to Bach in a little bit. But the thing about Mendelssohn, I played many of his piano pieces, primarily the Songs Without Words, and that's what you're hearing in the background, probably the most famous song without words. Now, Mendelssohn did not give these pieces names, but the publishers decided to call this one Spring Song. It's probably one of the most recognizable classical melodies of all time, and it often shows up in cartoons. So I learned that piece, and I learned many of the others from Songs Without Words. Number 3 on my list of famous composers is Franz Schubert, another German composer. He was actually, I should say, an Austrian composer, and he was of the late classical and early Romantic era. He didn't live very long, unfortunately. Many of these famous composers, like Mozart, lived a very short life. He was only 32, if I remember correctly, when he passed. But he left behind a vast amount of music, including 600 secular vocal works, mainly the German word is Lieder. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but basically he was a songwriter, and he was well known for his songs, 600 or more of them. He also wrote operas. He wasn't very successful with opera, but he tried to write operas. He wrote a large body of piano music, piano sonatas, chamber music. Probably the most famous song he wrote was called Erlkönig. The thing about Schubert's music that speaks to me is the man could write a melody. He really had a thing for writing melodies. And so many of his melodies are very familiar. They show up everywhere, you know. And so that's Franz Schubert. Number 2 is Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, a lot of folks are like, why isn't he number 1? Well, number 1, number 2, all these guys could be in any order, especially the last 2. Of course, everybody knows about Bach. He's probably the most famous composer of all. A German composer. He was from the late Baroque period. He's known for writing orchestral music like the Brandenburg concertos. You're actually hearing his air in G major, or air on the G string, I should say. He wrote cello suites, which are very famous, the Goldberg variations, the well-tempered clavier. That's where he's written preludes and fugues in every key. And he wrote that famous toccata and fugue in D minor. That's a piece that you hear in horror films. Da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. Well, you know, I don't have a big organ in my studio, big pipe organ, so I couldn't play that, you know. He also wrote things like the St. Matthew Passion, the Mass in B minor. And generally, since the 19th century, that was the time that Mendelssohn helped revive his music. He has, as I say, been regarded as one of the greatest composers in the history of Western music. And now, number 1 in my list of top 10 composers, Ludwig van Beethoven. And now you're hearing his famous piano piece, Für Elise, which is basically every piano student has had to learn at some point. He was another German composer. He started out as a famous piano virtuoso, and really he's one of the most admired composers in the history of Western music. And his works, pretty much everything he wrote, is the most performed classical music. And he's famous for spanning the transition from the classical period to the Romantic period. In his early days, he wrote a lot like Mozart, a lot like Haydn. He kind of was very influenced by these guys. But then and Beethoven divides into 3 periods. His early period, where he was like Mozart and Haydn, but in his middle period, he started to develop a more heroic style of music. He began to break some of the so-called rules of composition. And so his middle period, it shows him developing more as an individual. He began to develop the Beethoven style, if you like. Unfortunately, during this time in his middle period, he began to grow increasingly deaf. I can't think of anything more tragic for a composer or a musician to begin losing his hearing. But then in his late period, he really began to innovate more and more in musical form and expression. Some of his later piano sonatas, the Ninth Symphony, the late string quartets. These are amazing works of music, and they're all the more amazing when you realize that Beethoven couldn't really hear what he was writing. You know, and some people go, well, some of that later music is pretty strange. And indeed, during his lifetime, many of his late works were considered the ravings of a madman. But we listen to them today and we marvel at the brain power that it must have taken to write music like this. Music that transcends everything that had come before. Music where the forms are changed and the expression is deep and introspective and, wow, almost ethereal in its form. It's hard to describe Beethoven's late music, but to me that's his most fascinating period. I often find myself listening to the later piano sonatas, the string quartets, the later symphonies. Not that I don't like his earlier stuff, but there's just something about Beethoven's late music that just reaching into the future and foreseeing the developments that were going to take place during the Romantic period. So there you have it. Those are the top 10 composers. Well, the top 10 composers, as far as I'm concerned, at this point here in the fall of 2023, 22. Now, I may come back at a later date and have a new list of other composers, because certainly I have other composers that I love that are not included on this particular list. So I may come back and talk a little bit more about those guys and some of the women composers that I've been highlighting as well. My hope is that you'll further explore the work and life and music of these composers. I'll be talking more about them in future videos, because I think it's important that we learn about the life and work of these great musicians. So thanks for watching, and thanks for putting up with me rambling on about these things. And I appreciate it. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. You can support my work on Patreon. You can also contact me through my website. I'll leave all the links below. I will also leave links to the complete performances that you can find on YouTube of the pieces that you've been hearing in the background, because for copyright reasons I can't play the whole thing sometimes, just excerpts. So if you want to hear the whole piece, and I would encourage you to do that, you'll find those links below. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.